Gary Brecka recently appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience after helping UFC president Dana White lower his blood pressure with nutrition instead of drugs. This is an achievement that I fully support. Now, nevertheless, Brecka is doing great work by spreading the knowledge of the power of nutrition to large numbers of people, but his lack of a rigorous science background leads him to boil everything down to a $500 DNA test that tells you about 5 genes that you could have learned about elsewhere for far less money. And just because one of these 5 worked for Dana White does not mean that it will work for you. In fact, we now have solid data that each person has several highly unique genetic mutations that are not found in most of the people around them. So there simply are not any 5 genes that will provide answers for everyone. Now, that said, there are many points of agreement that I have with Brecka. So number 1, medicine, always treating disease and not thinking about deficiencies of raw materials. Number 2, folic acid is a terrible form of folate. Number 3, nutrition has a big impact on mental health. Number 4, seed oils are trash. Number 5, get morning sunshine, grounding, and breath work into your morning routine. Get cold exposure. And finally, hypothyroidism is something that can be fixed. It's not something that you're just born with or that you got from your father, your mother, something that just came up and you need to go on thyroid hormone forever. Hypothyroidism can be fixed with nutrition. These are points that I fully agree with. But he is wrong about methylation, and this stems from a poor understanding of basic biochemistry, and it leads to an extremely misleading focus on just 5 genes that are useful to know, but are ultimately distractions from the most useful genetic information that people need to know about. And like I said before, we now have solid data that each person has several highly unique genetic mutations that are not found in the people around them. And so there simply are not 5 genes that are going to provide answers for everyone. Now, Brecka says he's a, quote, human biologist and had 8 years of undergrad and postgraduate education in human biology.
For the record, I am not a physician. I'm not licensed to practice medicine. I'm a human biologist. I didn't, learn my trade in medical school. I took 8 years of undergrad and postgraduate education in human biology.
But his website says that he has 2 bachelor's degrees, one in biology from Frostburg State University and the second in human biology from National College of Chiropractic. He says that when he was getting his second human biology degree, he was in grad school.
When I was getting my second human biology degree, I was in grad school.
But how do you get a bachelor's degree in grad school? So evidently his biology background is limited to the undergraduate level. Now, I don't know why it takes 8 years to get 2 closely related bachelor's degrees, but ultimately the fact that Brecka only has biology up to the undergraduate level shows in how he misunderstands the basics of biochemistry. He starts off the interview saying that everything that comes into our bodies is in an unusable form, and it must be made usable by methylation. And he says that this is analogous to the conversion of crude oil to gasoline. This is crazy. There are hundreds of targets of methylation, and there are at least hundreds of thousands of substances in our bodies. So most things are not getting methylated. And most methylation is actually directed at a small handful of targets. 90% of it is used to synthesize creatine and phosphatidylcholine. And much of the other 10% is used to break down histamine and dopamine or to regulate DNA expression. In fact, a big chunk of that other 10% is also used to detoxify compounds to help remove them from the body, not to activate them as they're coming into the body. The idea that everything must be methylated to be activated is applied in the most absurd case where he says that T4 is converted to T3 in the gut.
If you look at the thyroid, and this happened in Dana's case too, he had low T3. So, again, the question is, where does the rest of the T3 hormone come from? Well, it is methylated from T4. We take T4 and when we break it down into T3, and this happens in the gut.
Now, I want to show you this diagram of T4 and T3 so that you can see clearly that you don't get from T4 to T3 by methylating it. The conversion of T4 to T3 actually happens primarily in the liver, not the gut, and it does not ever happen through methylation. So what you can see on the left is that T4 is called T4 because it has 4 iodine atoms. There's one up here, there's one down here, and there's 2 more over here. And when you go to T3, you see that there's only 3 iodine atoms. So what happened what happened is one of them was removed. Now, when you're looking at diagrams like these, all of the connecting angles represent carbon atoms. And you always assume that each carbon atom is bound to 4 other things. And if you don't see something depicted in the picture, you know that what's implied is that the binding sites are occupied by hydrogen. And so when you look at the left and you see this iodine that is disappearing in the figure on the right, you see that nothing else has replaced it that is depicted in the diagram. That means that what has replaced that iodine atom is a hydrogen atom. So when you convert T4 to T3, you don't methylate it. You just take off the iodine and you add a hydrogen atom. That's all you do. There's no such thing as methylating T4 to T3. Now, Brecka says that 40 to 60% of people have compromised MTHFR, and that this drives the intolerance of folic acid, the synthetic form of folate that's added to the food supply. But actually, poor conversion of folic acid into folate has nothing to do with MTHFR and has everything to do with the deficiency of DHFR, that's dihydrofolate reductase, which is the enzyme, not MTHFR, that converts folic acid to the food-based folate. The DHFR enzyme, that gene, is not included at all in Brecka's DNA report. Then he says that folic acid doesn't prevent neural tube defects, but it does. Randomized controlled trials show that folic acid supplementation reduces the recurring incidence of neural tube defects in women that already had a first pregnancy with one by 70%. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the ideal form of folate. It's not. But if we're going to advocate for the highest quality ingredients in our food and supplements, we shouldn't start with falsehoods like the idea that folic acid doesn't prevent neural tube defects. The data show that it does. Then he says that an example of a high folate diet is a carnivore diet with lots of pastured meat. Now, it would make sense that pastured meat would be higher in folate than regular meat, but there's no data to support that. And actually meat is, with the exception of liver, meat is very low in folate. The best sources of folate are liver, legumes, and dark greens. Now, the big problem through all of this is his belief that everyone's health is limited by methylation and that all methylation issues come down to just 5 genes. Neither of these things are true. Like I said earlier, he tests these 5 genes for $500, but you could have learned about these 5 genes elsewhere for far less money and gotten way more information. And just because one of these 5 works for Dana White does not mean that it'll work for you. Now, we have solid data now that each person has several highly unique genetic mutations that are not found in most of the people around them. So there simply are not any 5 genes that provide answers for everyone. So here are some examples where this basic misunderstanding of science gets into practical problems for the things that he's recommending. So first of all, it's true that MTHFR variants are widespread, but the fact that they're so common reflects that through most of human history, they must not have been a very big deal. In fact, the data show that an extra 1.6 milligrams of riboflavin, which is what you could get on a very high riboflavin diet, and brings people to about double what they are normally getting from food in the standard Western diet. But that extra 1.6 milligrams of riboflavin will take care of even the worst of the common MTHFR variants and make them function normally. And if you find that thoughts get stuck in your brain, Gary is right that this could be a gene for a slow COMT, or catechol O-methyltransferase. But this slow COMT is found in 25% of people. So if thoughts get stuck in your brain worse than every 1 out of the 4 people you know, then you probably need to be looking beyond COMT and to look at other genes and other deficiencies. If you're just, I have 10 friends and a couple of others ruminate just as much as I do, fine, that might be COMT. But if you feel like you have a bigger problem than those couple, 2 or 3 out of 10 friends, then you probably need to be looking elsewhere. Brecka has a rather odd view of neuroscience. He says, for example, that Adderall works for ADHD because it brings up the pace of the brain to match the racing pace of the mind. Now, this differentiation between the brain and the mind operating at completely different paces is kind of a weird idea of neuroscience. But the more important point is that what Adderall is actually doing is it is blocking the uptake of dopamine into storage vesicles within the neuron, and it is forcing it out of the reuptake transporters in reverse to push dopamine into the synapse. Now, if you look at ADHD is not about having fast or slow COMT or MTHFR or any of the other 5 genes that are on Brecka's report. But the big differences with ADHD are the presence of very rare genes and also the commonality of 3 to 5% loss of total brain volume, with the loss of brain volume concentrated in areas of dopamine-based neurons that control attention. What Adderall is doing is it's forcing dopamine into the synapses to compensate for this. And it's highly effective against ADHD symptoms, but it is barely effective, if at all, for boosting cognitive performance in healthy people. So it certainly isn't speeding up the brain. Now, I do agree with him that ADHD involves too many windows of attention being open, but he never brought up the role of GABA in shutting those windows. And the 5 methylation genes that Brecka looks at could help uncover why some people get stuck ruminating if it's due to a slow COMT gene, but they're not going to do anything to uncover why Adderall helps compensate for a loss of dopamine neurons or uncover when GABA could be useful to help improve focus. Brecka says that everyone with high blood pressure and high homocysteine should consider using trimethylglycine or TMG to lower their homocysteine.
And say the word again. What is it? What's the amino acid called?
Trimethylglycine, TMG.
Is that
capital T, capital M?
Similar to regular glycine?
No, this is trimethylglycine. It's a little bit different than the amino acid glycine. So trimethylglycine will actually help to metabolize, to help give the body the raw material it needs.
I feel like I should write this shit down. I'm gonna write down trimethylglycine.
He's gonna be on trimethylglycine tomorrow.
Well, I just want to keep track of all these different things you're saying, and oftentimes I do forget. So trimethylglycine. I'm gonna write
trimethylglycine, or just put capital TMG. That's what it'll say on the bottle.
TMG. Okay.
Now let's take a look at the methylation pathway to see what this is doing. So up in the top left, you see that MTHFR is helping folate, specifically methylfolate, get used in conjunction with vitamin B12 to help recycle homocysteine to methionine. If MTHFR or the other enzymes involved in that pathway are not working well, you can certainly rely on trimethylglycine, which uses the enzyme BHMT or betaine homocysteine methyltransferase in order to do the same thing as an alternative. However, BHMT has common polymorphisms that make that enzyme operate more slowly, and those aren't covered in the 5 genes in Brecka's report. So what if someone has a slow BHMT gene? That means that TMG is not going to work for them. So TMG is not a cure-all for some of the enzymes in this pathway not working. And you're not going to know from his genetic report when the TMG is not going to work. Now let's talk about sleep. So Brecka says that S-adenosyl methionine, or SAMe, is a great supplement for sleep.
What would be a good supplement for them?
SAMe, magnesium 3 and 8.
What is SAMe?
S-adenosyl methionine. SAM, capital SAM, little e. So SAMe, S-adenosyl methionine.
I'm going to write this down too.
Now, this is true for some people, partly because methylation is needed to make melatonin. But before methylation gets involved in making melatonin, the amino acid tryptophan needs to enter the brain. It needs to be converted to 5-HTP and then be converted to serotonin using vitamin B6. Even if you take 5-HTP directly, you still need vitamin B6 to convert it to serotonin. And then you need vitamin B5, or also known as pantothenic acid, to convert it to N-acetylserotonin. And only then can you rely on methylation to convert it to melatonin. So what if someone needs more B5 or more B6? SAMe is not going to help them. Brecka says that carbohydrate is not necessary for life. There's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate.
There is no such thing, by the way, as an essential carbohydrate. I get in debates with people about this all the time. Carbohydrates are necessary for life. And I'm like, well, then name an essential carbohydrate, because it doesn't exist. We have essential fatty acids, we have essential amino acids, and we have essential nutrients. But carbohydrates are not necessary for life.
Now, this is only true because carbohydrate is so important to our physiology that we can make it from protein using gluconeogenesis. Nevertheless, eating carbohydrate is the best way to get tryptophan into the brain because the spike in insulin from the carbohydrate is what drives tryptophan into the brain. So for people that need to get more tryptophan into their brain, carbohydrate is what they need to sleep well at night. There's lots of other things that could cause sleeping problems. For example, some people could be overstimulated by sulfite and they need more molybdenum to solve the problem. Other people could need more glycine to lower their core body temperature or GABA to calm them down. Thus, there are far more nutritional issues that can disrupt sleep than methylation, which means that there are just a lot more solutions than just taking SAMe. When Rogan told Brecka that his wife had sleeping problems, Brecka said that if he ran a cheek swab on Joe's wife, he could tell her exactly what she's deficient in.
Not that I have a hard time. I don't have a hard time. My wife does.
Does she?
Yeah, she has a hard time going to sleep. I can sleep on
Dude, I should do this.
the floor of a moving train.
I'll do a cheek swab on her and I'll tell her exactly what she's deficient in.
But this just isn't true. The 5 genes in his report don't tell you anything about your needs for vitamin B5, vitamin B6, carbohydrate, glycine, or GABA. Now, if we look at the methylation pathway, one of the things that we'll see is that in order to support methylation, we need lots of NADPH and lots of ATP. So this is the pathway of the several different ways that you can make methylfolate. And it is simplified, but I'm emphasizing several key points. So first of all, we need to get the carbon from somewhere, and it's generally coming from serine or glycine. But if you look at where serine or glycine comes from, yes, we do eat these amino acids as part of the protein in our diet, but the vast majority of serine and glycine in your body comes from endogenous synthesis. And what do you make it from? You make it from glucose. So glucose, with the help of NAD, which is a derivative of niacin or vitamin B3, and with the help of vitamin B6, gets converted to serine. And serine, with further help from vitamin B6, gets converted to glycine. Now, either serine or glycine, serine with the help of B6, glycine with the help of NAD, can generate one carbon leaving, and that is formate. Or serine with further help from vitamin B6 can add a carbon directly to folate as it's converted to glycine. Now, if you use serine to donate that carbon to form glycine and then add the carbon directly to folate, you will get methylene folate, which then enters directly into the MTHFR enzyme to make methylfolate. When you do that, you use vitamin B2 or riboflavin, and you use NADPH, another form of niacin or vitamin B3. A lot of the methylfolate production, however, comes from formate. And in order to add formate to folate, you need to use ATP. That makes methylfolate. Then you need to use NADPH to make methylene folate. And then you need to use NADPH and vitamin B2 or riboflavin again to make methylfolate. Now, this presence of NADPH, in order to keep getting enough NADPH to keep doing this, you need to use the pentose phosphate pathway. The pentose phosphate pathway needs the enzyme glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase, or G6-PDH. This is the most common genetic impairment in the world, and it's not one of the 5 genes on Brecka's report. That also requires glucose, which is the main carbohydrate in your body, as well as thiamine, calcium, and magnesium. Now, we see glucose pop in here twice, once as the major source of serine and glycine, and another as the driver of the pentose phosphate pathway, which supplies most of the NADPH. And in both cases, you are using glucose to help form methylfolate. So Brecka can say that there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, and carbohydrates are not necessary to life. And yes, that's true because you can make your carbohydrate out of protein. You don't need to eat it. But this shows you that many people will have lack of enough carbohydrate to make methylfolate, because if you don't eat carbohydrate, yeah, you'll make it from protein, but you're also going to slow down the breaking down of glucose, known as glycolysis, which will slow down the production of serine and glycine, making it harder to make methylfolate. Now, what does the significance of ATP mean over here? This means that you are relying on a bunch of other nutrients that are not made in the screen, because the major source of ATP is in mitochondrial energy metabolism. That requires all of the B vitamins. That requires all of the electrolytes. That's sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, and phosphate. And it requires iron, copper, sulfur, and molybdenum. Sodium and potassium are both needed to make ATP, and Brecka seems to be biased towards believing everyone needs more sodium. He says that most of us are clinically deficient in sodium. Clinical deficiency of sodium is called hyponatremia, and the overall prevalence is only about 2.5%, although it rises to 15% among those admitted to hospitals and above 40% among those in critical care. Now, hyponatremia is very important, but most of us are not walking around with clinical sodium deficiency. He then gets sodium backwards when he says that it hydrates cells rather than the blood. Sodium is the main extracellular electrolyte, and it draws water into the extracellular fluid and the blood. Potassium is the main intracellular electrolyte, and it is potassium that draws water into cells. We need to pay attention to both of these because both of them, along with many other nutrients, are needed for ATP production. There are, moreover, hundreds of genetic reasons to have a problem making enough ATP. The most recent data from May of this year is the 1 million exome study, which shows the nearly universal influence of rare disease genes, making each individual highly unique in why they would not be able to make enough ATP. This sampled 985,830 individuals of diverse descent from all kinds of continents and ethnic backgrounds. The average burden of clinically relevant mutations for rare metabolic diseases was 1.6 per person. My calculations are that this is likely underestimated and should be seen as 1.8 to 12 per person. And this means that there's a small handful of genes in each person that far outweigh the effect of the other 14 million polymorphisms. But that also means that each one of us have important mutations that are not found in any of the other people that we know. That means there's no way you're going to get everyone onto a gene chip that gives you a report on just 5 genes. And so what are these? These are 1,451 established inborn errors of metabolism. How do they impact energy metabolism, such as the production of ATP? Well, 323 different mutations, or different disorders rather, that each are made of multiple different mutations, impact the infrastructure of cellular energy metabolism. 236 of these disorders directly impact the use of protein, fat, or carbohydrate for energy, and 108 of these directly impact the utilization of a vitamin or mineral that is needed in energy metabolism. So overall, each person has about 1 to 6 nutritionally actionable rare disease genes that are far more impactful than any other genes, and none of these are going to be in the just 5 genes covered in Brecka's report. So the handful of mutations that are most important in you are not going to be found in anyone that you know, and whole genome sequencing is the way to figure them out, not a simple test of 5 common mutations. Now, if you have a problem making ATP, that means that you have a problem making methylfolate. So tell me again how methylation is all about 5 simple genes? Whole genome sequencing costs $400 and looks at all of this, whereas Brecka charges $500 to only look at 5 genes. So tell me again how Brecka can run a cheek swab on Joe's wife and tell her exactly why she has difficulty sleeping? I'm sorry, but he can't. If she has a deficiency of MTR, MTRR, MTHFR, HCY, or COMT, Brecka will have gotten lucky in figuring it out. But if her problem is she needs more B5, more B6, more molybdenum, more GABA, more glycine, better transport of tryptophan into the brain, or a nutrient involved in the pentose phosphate pathway, or ATP production, or hundreds of mutations that can underlie problems in those areas, then we've opened it up to hundreds of causes that are not going to be on Brecka's cheek swab. So in conclusion, Brecka's doing great work by spreading knowledge of the power of nutrition to large numbers of people, and I agree wholeheartedly about using nutrition instead of drugs, putting together a great sunshine, earth, and breath-based morning routine, getting cold exposure, trashing seed oils, using the highest quality nutrients. But his lack of a rigorous science background leads him to boil everything down to a $500 DNA test that tells you about 5 genes that you could have learned about elsewhere for far less money. And just because one of these 5 work for Dana White does not mean that it's going to work for Joe's wife, and it does not mean that it's going to work for you. In fact, we now have solid data that each person has several highly unique genetic mutations that are not found in most of the people around them. So there simply are not 5 genes that provide answers for everyone, no matter what 5 you pick. So if you like this analysis, check out the links in the description for more detailed information about MTHFR, methylation, and how to find your needle in a haystack set of super unlocks from proper genetic testing.